Yeah, so I'm Ed Smith. I'm going to talk this afternoon about violence in games. Thanks everyone for coming, first of all. I hope you're enjoying it. Over the past 5, 7, maybe 10 years, there's been a crop of games that I think have emerged, not necessarily consciously, but perhaps subconsciously or vicariously, as a response to the kind of games that existed before that. Games like Journey, games like Dear Esther, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, Braid, Beyond Eyes, The Unfinished Swan, games like this. And not necessarily purposefully, but I think that what they provide is a kind of illustration of something else that games can be. What games can do differently compared to what they used to do in the 90s and the 80s. And they also sort of offer a gateway, like an accessibility. If you weren't familiar with games, if you weren't a big game player, I think that something like Journey or something like Dear Esther is a lot more accessible and less alienating than a huge shooter or something that's kind of 60 hours long. So I think that these games are very valuable because they've kind of challenged and upset the old standards of what we used to hold as video games, what video games ought to be, what they ought to do. And I think that a lot of those old standards were bullshit, were rubbish. I think that games for a very long time were very bad and sort of a brick wall, and I would have struggled to kind of justify them to a lot of people. So yeah, some of these games in the past 5 years I think are very valuable, but our main genres are still fantasy, sci-fi, fairy tale, action. Our characters are still largely robots, superheroes, monsters, fairies, archetypes, stereotypes. I think the games are still very much shut off from reality. There's no kind of journalistic propensity for real life. There's nothing much that games say to us about what it's like to be alive now, what it's like to be a person. I don't think that they've earned a place in cultural history in the same sense that books, theatre, art, movies, etc. have. And that's why I think that violence is important. Violence is not something that game makers should be afraid of. It should be part of the catalogue of subject matter that game makers are willing to deal with, as much as fantasy, heroism, and so on. That being said, I think we're all aware that the way games deal with violence currently, or largely, is fucking awful. Games have taken violence, which in fiction is often like a very impassioned, very important, and very sort of revolting or evocative thing, and games have turned it into just like an input, something that we merely do. We don't really think about the violence we commit in games, we simply do it, we just enact it. And that's best kind of summarised by the fact that we call the people that we kill in games enemies, in this kind of like generic, catch-all, en masse sense. We don't kill people, we don't kill identifiable individuals, we just remove people as if they're obstacles. It's a ludic challenge, it's just something that we input into the game in order to create an output, i.e. progressing to the next level. And that's a dynamic that's existed since the very earliest days of games. If I look at something like Space Invaders, which awards you points for killing these generic alien creatures, I don't see much difference in that to something like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo, which challenges you to eliminate X amount of generic enemies and then rewards you with progression. It's a paradigm that continues to exist even as other things in video games advance, like a skyscraper. So as much as violence, I think, needs to continue to exist in games because it provides an access to difficult human emotions and experiences, the way that it's represented needs to change entirely. What needs to happen, I think, and I'm paraphrasing something that was written by Steve Gaynor, who was one of the directors on Gone Home, is that violence needs to be written into games in the same way that it's usually been written into sort of great theatre, into great literature. Now I know it's unfair and it's often a false equivalency to compare games to other media, I know that, but violence in games is only really legitimate if it's committed against someone who is a character, who has an identity, who has a name, and if their death or if the violence enacted against them affects the broader narrative, if it changes things, if it changes the protagonist, or if it changes the course of the story. Otherwise it's just meaningless, it's numbing. You think of some of the kind of greatest writing in human history, and violence has always been an integral part of that. I mean, Oedipus killing his father, Hamlet murdering Banquo, something like Guernica by Picasso, Dali's Crucifixion, even like Sonny being murdered in The Godfather, are huge, significant, dramatic moments in these respective pieces. And it's because the violence is legitimised, it's meaningful, it makes us feel something beyond a mere sense of ludic progression. Violence should make you uncomfortable, violence should make you unhappy, it should make you challenged, it should make you feel as if something has been lost. I think that one of the problems in games at the moment is that although we purport to explore emotional experiences and human drama of some sort, what we're largely interested in is positivity and sort of prettification. Even the games that are kind of ostensibly sad or designed to make you unhappy or feel something or have a slightly dour ending, I think are quite timid and minor and insouciant. Like the ending of Beyond Eyes, like, oh no, the cat died, and it's kind of like a small kind of fairy tale. It's not like urgent literature. I think Journey is very sort of frail and minor and doesn't really do much. It's just a little bit timid. And I think that violence done properly is a way to give games teeth and a kind of viciousness, a sort of urgency that is largely absent from them at the moment. Simply plundering positive human experiences turns games into this quite blithe, almost like masturbatory exercise, whereas I think sort of true art, true writing is interested in the full catalogue of human experience, and violence is a true human experience. People everywhere experience violence. People in this room will experience violence. Violence is as much a valid human experience as happiness. Alienation, anger, jealousy, rage, passion, disappointment, oppression, suffering. These are all human emotions and experiences. And I think that games, if they want to call themselves artistically credible, need to be open to these things. So then we return to that metric of how do you do violence well? And I'm trying to think of some games that exist currently which perhaps in some small ways live up to that standard, prohibitive though it might sound. If we think about violence being enacted against named and important characters, I would perhaps go to something like The Last of Us. Now, obviously I'm going to spoil the ending of The Last of Us because you have to talk about games properly. I can see someone has got their hands over their face because they don't want to hear this. All I'll say is that a very, very important character dies towards the end of The Last of Us and is killed by the main protagonist. And it's not just an empty action. It happens in a cutscene, it's not something that we do, but it's an act of violence in a game that means something beyond, oh great, I've killed all the enemies. The Metro games do this. They do it in a sort of roundabout way, but they do it. Whereby, although you're killing generic enemies, the gunfights in Metro are a struggle. Your weapons are unreliable, the technology you're using often breaks, and what that creates is like a sense of kind of purpose and sort of fear in the violence. It makes it mean something, it makes it resonate beyond just the sense of completing a game. I'm trying to give any others. You see how rare this is? There probably are some others. The Mafia games have a couple of moments in them, but I'm reticent to compliment the Mafia games because they're designed by Daniel Vavra, who is a supporter of Gamergate, so fuck him. There are several others. There are a few examples. I think that the violence in Haze, which is not a great game in most people's minds, has these moments because a lot of the kind of people that you kill, the kind of boss fights, are characters that have been defined prior to that. They're not simply a boss that emerges out of the ground like "Rah," and has a health bar. They're people that you've spoken with before and interacted with. They are people, they're characters, and when they die, you get a sense of something changing. So if games can do that more, and sort of involve themselves with violence more willingly, really sort of get their hands dirty, because that, I think, is what great art is about. It's about sort of rolling almost in the kind of filth of the world, in kind of muddying yourself in the whole range of human emotions and experiences, not just picking the pleasant ones because they're easiest to work with. I'd argue, in fact, I mean, the title that I gave for this talk is that video games need to be more violent. But I think that the violence that we have now is not violence. It's gore and it's spectacle and it's empty. It's just like a celebration. It's like a puff of air. It's not violence because violence makes you feel revolted. Violence makes you feel unhappy. Violence makes you feel uncomfortable. So what games need is not more violence, but just violence, full stop. And I think the kind of slightly aloof, tish and piffle attitude that I often read now in the gaming press or from developers or from players even, about games now being sort of more sophisticated and more cultivated and sort of more pristine and prestigious, to the point where they shouldn't muddy themselves in violence lest they be soiled and return back to the sensibilities of the 90s. I don't think that that's fair at all. I think that if games want to call themselves sophisticated and bright and important and culturally relevant, then violence and negative human experience is absolutely something that they need to work with and engage with. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.